Welcome to the Prosperity Playbook. You are here with Britt, Jill, Renee, and Courtney while we talk about rental properties, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Courtney, you've got a rental property.
Yes, it is a short term. I finally got the renters out of my house. I have been a single mom for a lot of the time that I've lived here, and I always had a rental either in the basement or over the garage, long-term rental. And now I have short-term rental in a separate building on the same property.
So let's maybe go back and define some of these things. So long-term rental, short-term rental, what's the difference there?
Good call.
Short-term rental is typically less than 30 days, and our city of Bozeman had passed an ordinance recently that limits where you can have the short-term rentals, and the long-term rental is typically over 30 days, but that could be midterm. Considered
For
midterm
insurance
now.
purposes too, long-term rental is a 6-month or more lease typically.
That's
Okay.
good to know.
Thank you. That's interesting.
Yeah, and it depends on your HOA and your covenants, your zoning, everything as well of what you are allowed to have.
For those just tuning in, some of this is going to be specific to our area, which is Bozeman, Montana. If you've ever seen Yellowstone, that's a fictional show. This is fictionally where it is based. But Bozeman, Montana has some interesting regulations as regards to short-term rentals. Think Airbnb. So we'll go into a little bit of that. We touched a little bit about, if you're looking to have a short-term or a long-term rental, it's definitely worth looking into any HOA covenants, any condo covenants or bylaws, any kinds of restrictions that could potentially limit your use of your property. We all like to think, oh, I bought this place. Now there are no rules because I'm an owner. And that's not necessarily the truth.
And your HOA can change them.
They
So
can.
I knew a gentleman that had his own house as an Airbnb when he wasn't using it. And his neighborhood, which wasn't anything fancy, changed the rules to they had to be 60-day rentals.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's a hard one.
And your city can change it too. That's what Bozeman has been doing is
Yep.
starting to-
Bozeman changed it where you have to be in a certain zoning. You have to get on the waiting list if you do qualify. And they prohibited if you are not living on the property at all, you cannot have an Airbnb in the city.
Yeah, I went and visited my girlfriend in New York, and that rule had just been established in New York City as well, where you have to be living there as the property owner in order to have a short-term rental on property.
Wow, New York is the first place I ever stayed in one.
Really?
The bed was terrible, but it was great in Times Square.
So let's talk about that really quick though, because I think that's kind of an interesting topic. Why are cities trying to put squash on this?
They are trying to keep the rents and housing more affordable, and they turn to short-term rentals as a reason why our property costs went up.
There's another little aspect to that too.
Okay.
They get a lot of money from the hospitality
That's
industry.
what I was going to say.
And so hotels and bed and breakfasts, resorts, things like that, they're very threatened by the Airbnb industry because it's an alternative for people as opposed to staying in a hotel. They can then, rent somebody's private home or a room in somebody's house. We all understand as travelers that it's a completely different dynamic when you're going to an Airbnb as opposed to a hotel. You have more amenities. You're able to have a little bit more autonomy. You can cook for yourself. You're not spending as much going out to restaurants. But to the hospitality industry's point, that also drives down, the amount that they're able to make in revenue from travelers that are coming to their city.
And it was a lot here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and look at the amount of hotels that are coming in here now. Those guys are lobbying for that to go away so that they continue to have more and more people that are paying for hotel rooms. Cities are trying to fight the short-term rental. I think also in the HOAs and the condos, they don't love the revolving door there. They don't like the extra cars. They don't like the people are there partying. So I think we do see some of that where they would prefer the long-term renters. As a property owner, I have a short-term rental in Scottsdale, Arizona. I kind of prefer it to be short-term because for me, I feel like somebody's in that property every a couple days, couple weeks, or a couple months, depending on how long they're renting it, as opposed to a long-term renter where nobody's in there for a long time and you don't really know what's happening with the property. What are your thoughts on that, Courtney?
I agree. We get told when things are not working all the time, so
Totally.
we're able to
I need
go
a new
in and fix
teapot
them.
I got last week.
Yeah.
And I had a long-term renter in my first basement rental and came downstairs one time and I said, "Why is there water running down the wall?" And she goes, "Oh, it's been like that. I just don't want to upset you." And I was like, "You need to upset me. You
Well,
need
I
to
think
tell me."
as somebody who has been a renter at many different places, at short-term rentals, I take much better care of the property.
Yes,
I'm not putting any
totally.
holes in the walls. I'm not staining the carpets with wine. I'm not, there's a lot less damage that is done
Less
because
wear and tear.
yeah, because you don't feel as much like it's your space, whereas long-term renters, it is your space.
Yeah.
That
It's
makes
not
sense.
true across the board that they're that way because I'm on a lot of forums for short-term rentals across the country and some of them can get trashed, but having it at your own property, they know you're next door.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, because you go in and clean it yourself, that who did what.
Yeah.
Will you talk a little bit about that? What made you decide to do it yourself instead of using a property management company? What are the perks? What's the hard parts? Tell us all about it.
My main reason was to have control over the calendar because the reason why I wanted to do this was I am in real estate. Sometimes I have clients that will be in between houses or they want to be here first to look at property and not be in a rush so they could stay there longer term. If I have family or friends need to come to town, or right now we discovered a leak in our wall. If we needed to go stay in it and it was vacant, then we could just go stay in it. We got married at home, so we were able to have our guests stay in them. And it's worked out really well for a lot of local people that have also had water issues in the wintertime when their pipes have broken and they're able to bring their dog and make it feel like home. It was a big deal during the quarantine period when people were working remotely, or if they just want to come try out our town and see if they would want to live here, then they're not obligated to any kind of lease. They don't have to buy anything. They can just stay for 30 days.
Smart.
So let's compare. So would you consider your place an ADU or would you consider that a duplex or
Just to define it, an ADU is an alternative dwelling unit.
Auxiliary.
Auxiliary. Thank
Yep.
you. Auxiliary dwelling unit.
What does that even mean?
it means another dwelling unit on your property, but not technically a duplex.
It's your aux.
Right.
Yes. The ADU is typically a separate building. I discovered this when I sold my house that I thought it was called an ADU, and it was technically an apartment in my house because it was in the house. And so when they're detached, then they're an ADU.
So that might be over your garage or
Yep.
something? Okay.
Yep. And then if it's a completely separate building, then it's more likely a guest house.
Right.
And so, of course, again, the covenants and zoning will dictate what you can have.
And when you're looking to purchase a property, whether it's an investment property or whether it's a personal residence where you want to have an ADU for rental purposes, I would highly recommend hiring a real estate attorney to help you with reviewing the title commitment. That title commitment will have all of the encumbrances and restrictions for what you can and cannot do with your property. They'll review that with a fine-tooth comb, and you can kind of tell them at the beginning, here are my plans for the property. I want you to review the title commitment and let me know if there are any red flags for what I want to do. And they'll be able to assist with that process. Typically, they're reviewing really dense restrictive covenants and conditions for the property, either via HOA or a condo association or bylaws and the declaration. But they would be invaluable in that process.
Well, and on that same note, too, that will completely determine what type of insurance coverage you need to have on the property. So prior to purchasing it, definitely make sure you get a copy of the HOA or Condo Owners Association declarations and bylaws, because it will state in there what they are covering and what you need to cover. And sometimes they need to have their policies rewritten, because sometimes it basically says that either both of you don't need to cover anything or that both of you are covering everything. And so it's really important to know what you're getting into ahead of time, because you don't want to have already purchased it and then find out down the road, once there's a loss, that you don't have the right coverage in place.
That's a good point.
And you had talked before about having an umbrella policy for something like this.
Well, the umbrella policy will only cover your liability. It won't cover the property.
Right.
You managing it yourself versus property managers. So why did you make the decision to do it? You said you wanted to control the calendar. What other reasons?
Cost. Just to be able to retain as much of the income as possible. And the costs can vary a lot with property managers and people to clean. So we try to do all of it ourselves, but it can be difficult if we're going to be out of town. I have to have trusted person to come in and turn it over.
Well, Courtney, you have experience in the cleaning industry too, because you used to own a cleaning company. So you can get in there and you can polish with the best of them.
Yeah, I try to systematize it as much as possible. I have duplicates and triplicates of towels and covers and sheets and rugs and all the things.
Smart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and when it comes to insurance, they don't care if you use a property manager or if you do it yourself, but they do care if you have a lease agreement in place, if you are, doing background checks on potential tenants, if you have somebody on site pretty regularly. So that's a big problem that we run into, is if somebody decides
managers?
or the lack thereof, if somebody
Okay.
decides that they want to manage it themselves and they're only on site annually and they're not running background checks, insurance does not like that.
Well,
So if you owned a property in Arizona like Renee,
Yes,
you want to have a property manager that is on site more often is what you mean?
absolutely.
Okay.
Even if the property manager is your cousin Steve that lives there, that's totally fine. You just want to make sure that somebody is checking in on the property pretty regularly.
Well, and the lease is a big important step of it too, because it tells you whether or not you can do these short-term rentals under a lease. Airbnb arbitrage is a big industry right now where people are actually going in and leasing, apartment units in desirable areas and then turning around and having them listed as short-term rentals.
Long-term versus short-term property managers. Short-term is a lot more expensive because it is more for that property manager to deal with, because they are getting a call that says we would like a teapot. Like literally, that was one of the things when I was doing my taxes last week. Yes, I did my taxes in September. Don't judge me.
I have to go sign mine today.
But that was one of the expenses on there, was that the tenants wanted another teapot or whatever. So we have a property manager because I can't go fix a toilet in the middle of the night in Arizona when I live in Montana. And I literally do nothing on that place. I have access to a calendar that I can block out the dates that I want, or if I have family and friends that want to stay there. But other than that, the property manager sets my pricing for me. He handles scheduling all of the cleaning to come in. And typically a short-term renter, the tenants pay that $195 cleaning fee is what it is for ours. Or if we're there, we pay that. And they just send cleaners in so that it's ready for the next people. But he manages all of that. His crew comes in, they have all the duplicate towels and everything. They swap it in and out, get everything cleaned, manage it. And on the short-term rentals, I'm assuming there's no full background checks that they're doing like Airbnb and VRBO. I think there's like a ranking system. If you destroyed somebody's house, you're going to get a bad review and you may not be able to rent from the next people. But on an actual long-term rental, I actually think this is one of the biggest advantages to a property manager is they are going to screen your tenants for you. They are going to likely do a credit check. They might do background checks. And I have a good friend that's a property manager, and he told me he manages his personal rentals a lot differently than he manages the ones for other people's, because he's like, you've got a little old lady that's renting from you, and all of a sudden she comes to you and she's like, I'm not going to have my rent on time. If that's your own property, you might let her get away with it. But if you're managing it for somebody else, it's your job. And you can't let people get behind, and you're in there more often and you're checking things, and you don't get to have that bleeding heart type of a situation. So
Property management is the most thankless job.
I think so too. I
Yeah.
think it's one of the hardest things out there, and people think it's going to be easy money. And I just laugh when they say that.
I did it for 3 months when I got my real estate license.
What is the standard property manager fee for a long-term rental right now, would you say?
I have no idea. I was
10%?
going to ask you what you
I think it's 10 to 12, 15%. I think the long-term ones are more 20 to 25% just
Oh,
because
wow.
there
And I've
is
heard
so much.
50 on some.
Have you really?
40 to 50.
Wow. I mean, I guess I can see it. So definitely things to consider when you're figuring out what your budget is and if it's worth looking into. But let's talk about other kinds of things that can happen. So when you have a long-term renter, you have security deposits. So you have somebody that's paying probably at least 1 month's rent up front. And then when they go to check out, that, if they don't do a good job cleaning or there's damage, you can have that. But sometimes that damage can be even more than what that security deposit was. So I do think, like Britt said, those being on site once every 6 months or so to make sure things haven't completely fallen off the
Wheels.
is is good. But what about so like with VRBO and Airbnb, how does that work with those? Is there a deposit, and what happens? What's your repercussions?
VRBO charges a deposit, and Airbnb does not. Airbnb has a separate kind of insurance that, knock on wood, wherever that is, I have not had to tap into, but I've heard both ways that it's easy to use it and it's hard to use it. But what I really appreciate, despite the commercials VRBO puts out there, Airbnb, you can rent a room, you could rent part of somebody's house, or it could be a whole separate unit. And you get to choose when you're on there based on what your budget is. You, as a superhost, have immediate connection to customer service, and they help me give people's money back if they had to cancel for a extenuating circumstance. Like I had somebody whose dog got super sick like 10 days ago, and she was beyond the cancellation period, and so I can't cancel it for her. She can cancel it, and I can request her to get refunded. So
what does
works great.
Superhost mean? How do you get that? What does it mean?
You have a consecutive 5-star rating from your clients, and you respond in a certain amount of time, and you're booked a certain amount of time. And then they send us a $100 gift card to use at
Ooh,
Airbnb. And
nice.
so you
That's
can
pretty
have,
cool.
I think it's one a year of the
Cool.
gift cards. But VRBO on their commercials say that you get the whole house all the time, and they're the ones that charge the deposit. I haven't stayed in as many of those, nor have I used them for renting out.
When you touched on that Airbnb has insurance, and I think on the long-term side of things, I would highly, highly recommend that you require your renters to purchase renter's insurance and list you as an additional insured on the policy and provide you with a certificate of insurance.
That's a great tip.
To specify, that's for long-term renters. Yeah.
Because if somebody is hurt on the property, let's say something stupid like your renter spills a glass of water and a visitor comes to the property and slips and falls and breaks their arm because of the spill, that liability falls on the renter. And so it's going to use their renter's insurance first, and then your renter's insurance will come into play.
Your homeowner's insurance.
Or sorry, yes, your homeowner's, thank you.
You're welcome.
Then I had another situation this year where a pipe burst in the home and the renters had to move out for almost 2 full months
Oh, they probably stayed in my place.
while the home was being fixed. The landlord's policy may or may not cover that, depending on how they have their policy written. In this case, the landlord's policy did not cover that. So if they wouldn't have had renter's insurance, they would have just had to pay all of that out of pocket. But because of the renter's insurance policy, they were able to have the place that they stayed at paid for, as well as, they were having to go out to eat because the place they were staying at didn't have a kitchen. And so they were having to go out to eat more often. That was covered by their renter's insurance policy. So I would say, as a landlord, to just really help protect yourself and protect your clients, it's really important because your policy will cover anything that you own that is in that building. You'll want to get personal property coverage for, which includes the appliances. If you own the appliances, you absolutely do still need a little bit of personal property coverage. But if the house burns to the ground, your policy as the landlord will not cover all of the furniture and clothes and everything that your tenants own. So that is mainly what their policy is covering. If they ask you that question, why do I need renter's insurance? It's to cover all of your personal stuff.
And as a side note, if you own or rent in a condo building, you also want to have insurance for the inside.
Absolutely.
Because the condo only covers the studs out.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, yeah, you want to definitely check your HOA documents on that to say what it covers. But it's usually, wasn't it called an HO6 policy, something like that? It's kind of like a renter's policy, but for the interior of your condo. So let's go back. You talked about people bringing their dog earlier. So I'm assuming that means you allow pets.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Tell me about that decision. Was that a hard decision, or you just love your dog so much that it was easy?
Well, y'all all know the answer to that. And I actually have guests that book our place and tell us that they booked our place because they sell biscuits. Yeah, sweetest golden retriever.
So sweet.
But yes, I know. I mean, it's hard to find a hotel that's going to allow a dog, much less a cat. So we said no to cats originally, but one of the other reasons that we've had our smaller place rented, parents will rent it for their kids when they have issues with a roommate. One gal, I guess she was fearful of her life and had a cat.
Geez.
And so I was like, oh, yes, you can stay there with the cat. And it was fine. I'm allergic to cats, and I don't like litter box smell.
Right.
But other than that, it's fine.
Well, that's why I ask. I mean, we have not allowed pets in our Arizona place, and the reason we did when we bought it, my daughter was allergic to pets, and it just made sense. We wanted to still be able to go there. She's outgrown that now, but we've just never really changed it. But I hear from property managers that pets, while they can be the ones doing the damage, a lot of times it's the small children that are the ones that do the damage. Like they're banging into your cabinets and everything with their toys and whatever else.
Taking markers to the wall.
Right.
We very rarely get kids of any age stay in ours because it's upstairs.
Oh, that makes sense.
So it's not recommended for
Interesting.
crawling babies or toddlers or anybody that's going to fall down those stairs, and it says it in there. We do have a pack and play for the tiny ones that aren't going to be crawling. And then it doesn't work well for older guests either that would have a hard time with the stairs. And then the other place is just too small.
Gotcha.
So pets are fine.
My dad helps out a property manager in Wyoming, and he's told me some horror stories about dogs. Like there was one place that had brand new pine floors, and then they brought in, I think he said it was a Saint Bernard puppy, and they basically kept it inside all day, every day while they were out skiing and whatnot. And they had to completely sand down and refinish the floors, and they had to replace a couple of doors and a bunch of trim. But it was a puppy. And so I don't know if you can make a rule adult dogs are allowed, puppies aren't. Where do you draw the line? I don't know.
I don't know. Golden retrievers or puppies till they're like 5. So.
Yeah.
It's important to note as well that you cannot make restrictions on service animals. And depending upon your state, that also extends to emotional support animals. Just so everyone knows, emotional support animals and service animals don't necessarily have to be dogs or cats. Sometimes they're small ponies. Sometimes they're guinea pigs or rabbits. I worked in hotels in the hospitality industry most of my 20s. And so it was fascinating to see what people would bring in. I remember working at a resort, and we had to activate the handicapped swing for the pool to help take someone's support pony out of the pool.
Oh my God.
And bring it back up onto the cement.
That's a new one.
That is.
Yeah, for real. Well, let's shift gears back to if you're thinking about purchasing a property. So we've talked about some of the ups and the downs and the things you want to consider, but what does that actually look like? So obviously you can buy, we've talked about condos, we've talked about single family homes, we've talked about single family homes with an ADU. Another option is a multifamily property. So a duplex, triplex, fourplex, basically a great strategy that I've seen clients use is to buy something like that, live in one unit, and then rent out the other ones. And then you can use the projected rent or a portion of that projected rent from the other ones to help you qualify for that. And you can do that if you're not going to move into it as well. But if you're going to buy something as a rental property, you probably figure 20 to 25% down. If you're buying something as a primary residence that's multifamily, you can do it oftentimes with 3.5 to 5% down. So it gives you a lot of flexibility there. So it's a cool way to get into that rental market without having to put a lot of down payment, is if you are willing to occupy one of those units, at least for a year.
I have a friend who bought multiple multifamily units in Colorado, and his rule of thumb was he would go specifically for fourplexes because rent from one would cover his. And then, so what was it? It was 2 units covers the mortgage. The 3rd unit is just bonus cash. And then the 4th unit is your insurance. And so he had like a figure of all of the expenses and the income that would come in. And so that just worked for him. So he was at least getting income from one renter, and then the other 2 kind of paid for all of the expenses.
That's awesome. And I do think that that is the goal, right? And it can be hard to make those cash flow, especially with rates and property values and all of those things. But one strategy I'm seeing a lot of clients employing lately has been buying properties in a market that's not theirs. So if you think about middle of the country, well, that's why we bought our Arizona place. We were priced out of Bozeman for a rental. It was cheaper down there. Now it's not very cheap anymore. But at the time, it was great. And so I've got clients buying in like Wisconsin and Michigan and Tennessee and Ohio, places like that where there's a lot of colleges, but you can buy a fourplex for maybe $200,000. Are you seeing clients do that kind of stuff, Courtney?
Well, what I see here typically is parents buying the rental properties for their kid to live in while they're at Montana State.
Great point. I see that
We
too.
get that a lot. And I have seen some that I've sold 20 years ago. They still own them.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you've got a kid that's going to go to school here and maybe they're going to have 4 or 5 people total living in their house, like average rent for a room in Bozeman for college kids.
$1,000 a room.
Yep,
Yeah.
$1,000 a room. So if you can buy something that's got less than a $5,000 a month mortgage payment and you're owning something and your kids can live in that and they're all paying rent to you, or I've seen parents go in together on things, as we talked about on another one. I don't usually see partnerships go very well, so not a huge fan, but but it is something that you could do in an area where your kid's going to go to school, whether that's Montana or somewhere else.
As we're talking about purchasing different properties, I think it's important to talk about the liability of who owns the property.
Agreed.
Something that we see a lot on the insurance side of things is having each individual property owned by a separate LLC, because let's say you own 5 properties all under your personal name and there's a big accident on one of them and somebody dies. If they sue you, they get to sue you for all 5 of those properties and for everything else, any other assets that you have.
All
right?
personal assets.
Yep, exactly. Whereas if you own that property under one LLC and each other property under their own LLCs, they can only come after that one LLC's asset. So it can have major repercussions, or you can really, really protect yourself.
That's also an important note to make sure that you filed your homestead exemption for your personal primary residence, because that prevents people from being able to come after your primary residence as an asset under that scenario.
Great point.
I know that's valid in Montana. Which other states is that a thing?
That's state by state. So I recommend checking it
I
out.
think it was only about 5 states that
I know
have
Colorado has it too, but I'm not sure. Yeah, that's definitely one to research or talk to a real estate attorney on. Yeah.
So on the LLC topic, I have to say this because I'm a mortgage lender. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac don't do loans to LLCs. They'll give you a loan as an individual or a trust. So a lot of times what people will do when they're given this advice is they'll close in the name of their individual names. And then after your title policy has been issued, then you can typically quit claim the property into an LLC. That's my company's policy anyway. You would definitely want to check with your lender on that. But just keep in mind that every time you go to refinance that property down the road, you're going to have to quit claim it back into your personal name in order to get the loan and then do back to the LLC again later. So it's something you do want to check. Maybe legal ramifications of that, maybe tax ramifications of that. So just something to be aware of, not saying it can't be done, But just know that there's an extra little hoop to jump through on that piece of it. And let me just tell you that your mortgage lender is not going to give you that, because there isn't anybody that you're going to be able to reach in your mortgage company that is going to be able to have the authority to sign said letter for you. So it is a little bit of a calculated risk. However, if you really dive deep into the research on it, if you are quit claiming from the due on sale clause, there is a exception to that. If you are quit claiming from your individual name to an LLC with your same individual name, or a couple to the same ones, that doesn't technically trigger your due on sale clause. From what my understanding from reading that statute is that it does not do that. I have not ever seen that in my 20-year career happen where something was triggered on that. Basically, the real moral of the story is if you make your payments, your mortgage company isn't really going to pay attention to whether or not you have quit claimed it. However, if you start to miss payments, you get in a foreclosure situation, that's when they're going to care, and it's going to be one more reason for them to call your loan due. So
What does quit claim mean?
quit claim just means that you're deeding the property to yourself. Or to somebody else. There's no warranty associated with that, as opposed to like a warranty deed. You're just, people always actually call it a quick claim deed, it's actually a quit claim, QUIT. And you're just quitting your interest in the property and giving it to somebody else, essentially. Anything you want to add on that, Jill?
No, that's spot on. Yep.
So anyway, as with all things legal and mortgage, there are gray areas.
I think I blacked out there for a minute.
On the income property that you can own or occupy, what are the additional benefits on living in a duplex, triplex, and do you have any additional tax write-offs or?
Before we go on to that, I would just make note, if you are thinking about purchasing a property for investment purposes, potentially for your child to go to college, something like that, you definitely want to make sure that you have lease agreements for every occupant of that property, even your child, because that gives them some rights and it gives you some rights. So if for some reason your child goes off the rails and you're having a hard time reining them back in, that lease agreement could be something powerful in that dynamic to make sure that you can protect your investment, not only your investment in your child, but your investment in that real property too. And as much as you may trust your kids' friends, college is an interesting place where they get a lot of freedom and make some interesting choices. So it's always good to have that contract in place that provides you terms for termination and what that process looks like.
That's a super good point. So on that lease agreement, if you're not using, well, I assume if you have a property manager that they have a standard one that they're going to use. If you are doing it yourself, do you go to an attorney to have them draw that up for you?
I would recommend doing so. There are some great online resources, LegalZoom as one, that's just off the top of my head, but
Landlord associations.
Landlord associations.
Not only just your taxes and your insurance, a lot of times you can write off your utilities, your legal fees, maintenance fees. Sometimes, like if your property is located in another state, you can write off expenses to go visit said property to make sure it's still in good shape. So keep that in mind. And then the biggest tax advantage, I think, for real estate is what's called depreciation. And this is a paper write-off that just basically is something that you can claim over time. It's not actual dollars that you're writing a check for, but it's a paper expense that you get to claim.
And there's recapture on that, isn't there?
Yes, there is. And since none of us are accountants, we won't dive too deep into that because we'll definitely have people falling asleep. But yes, there is something when you do go to sell that property down the road, you could potentially have some recapture from that depreciation. So it is kind of a shorter term expense. But that brings up the last thing we were going to talk about on that, which is a 1031 exchange. So
Before we dive into that, I just will say, so if you're buying an investment property and it's of significant value, especially I would say if you're getting one of those multifamily units, like the building that has like a fourplex, something like that, there is a resource available to recapture that depreciation quicker. That's a cost segregation analysis. It's definitely worth talking to a CPA about that if you're planning to make that significant investment, because let's say you buy, one of those big apartment complexes. The typical depreciation schedule is about 30 years. I think it's 29 point something, as far as like how long you have to depreciate out the building. But if you do a cost segregation analysis, they go in and they look at every single aspect of that building. So they're saying, all right, doorknobs, those depreciate in 6 years. Windows, those
Oh, boy.
depreciate in 12 years.
That's
And
it.
so the cost segregation analysis it's usually like a couple $1,000s, but you can end up saving and capturing that depreciation value the first year that you purchase that building instead of over that 30-year timeline. So it can be a significant value, but it's worth talking to your CPA to determine if it's a good fit for you.
That's an awesome tip.
Yep.
And that actually brings up a good point that you can look at purchasing real estate that has more than 4 units. So my brain always goes to 4 units or less because that's what's considered residential real estate. But anything 5 units or more, you would just go get a commercial loan for that is essentially the difference on that.
It's a different interest rate, but
Yes, so different loan terms. You're not going to have a 30-year fix typically. Those you typically can own in an LLC. So that's one advantage there, I guess. And then when you do go to sell those properties down the road, a 1031 exchange is one of the ways that you can defer your taxes. So basically, we'll do a whole show on this at some point because it's kind of an involved topic and it's pretty cool. But the basic is if you go to sell the property, the proceeds from that real estate sale of an investment property, not on a primary residence, go into a qualified intermediary, which is a third party that essentially holds that money for you and you don't touch it. And then you go buy, yes, a QI for qualified intermediary. And then you go buy another property right away. And there are time restrictions on this and other restrictions, but then you take that same money that the qualified intermediary is holding and use that as your down payment or to pay cash for that other property. So you've never touched that money and therefore there's no taxable event that happens. And you can kind of just keep doing that and rolling it down the road. There's only really 2 ways to get out of it. One is to die, which we don't recommend. And the other one is to move into it as a primary residence for a certain period of time. And there's restrictions on that. So again, we'll go into that down the road. But just know that one of the advantages to owning rental real estate is tax benefits.
Here's to empowering each other one story at a time.